Somewhere in the rainforests of Costa Rica, there are stone balls sitting in the jungle that are almost perfectly round. Not roughly round, not approximately round. Round in the way that makes you stop and ask how, because the answer is not obvious, and the more carefully you look at them, the less obvious it becomes. Some of them are the size of a grapefruit. Others are taller than a person and weigh more than 15 tons. And the people who made them left no writing behind, no instruction manual, no explanation, just the spheres. That puzzle is where we're starting tonight. If you're using this to wind down, to let your mind drift somewhere quiet while the day finally loosens its grip, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I read them, and it genuinely surprises me every time. Someone in Osaka at 6 in the morning, someone in Dublin just after midnight, someone in Toronto who can't sleep and is watching the ceiling. All of you, in completely different worlds, listening to the same strange story at the same moment. That never gets old to me. And if you want to listen without ads and without background music, the best way to support this channel is to follow on Spotify. The link is in the description. No music, no interruptions, just the story. Now, back to the spheres. Here is what we know for certain. Humans in multiple places, across multiple eras, separated by oceans and centuries, carved large stones into spherical shapes. That is not in dispute. The spheres exist. They've been measured, photographed, excavated and analysed. What is in dispute, what remains genuinely open and genuinely interesting, is almost everything else. Why spheres specifically? How they were made with such precision using tools that, by any reasonable accounting, should not have been up to the task. Why some of them were moved enormous distances from where the stone was quarried. What they were for. And perhaps most strangely, why people in places that had no known contact with each other looked at raw stone and decided the right shape was a perfect ball. Those are not rhetorical questions. Archaeologists are still working on them. Some of the answers are better supported than others. Some theories have solid evidence behind them and some are speculation dressed up as fact. And part of what we're going to do tonight is try to tell the difference. Because these objects deserve that. They are strange enough on their own merits. They do not need exaggeration. The evidence-first version of this story is actually more interesting than the version where ancient aliens show up, or where a forgotten global civilization is quietly responsible for everything. Because the real version involves human beings, specific human beings living in specific places, doing something extraordinarily difficult for reasons that were meaningful to them in ways we can only partially reconstruct. That is a harder and more honest kind of mystery than the ones with easy answers. So here is how we're going to approach it. The anchor case, the place where the evidence is deepest and the scholarship is most developed, is the Diquis Delta in southern Costa Rica. The spheres found there are called the Diquis spheres, and they are the most studied, most numerous and most precisely documented stone spheres anywhere in the world. There are hundreds of them. They were made by a culture that flourished roughly between 600 and 1500 CE, though some dating questions remain genuinely open. They were carved from a hard stone called gabbro, quarried from mountains miles away, moved through dense jungle and river systems, and placed with apparent intentionality at sites that seem to have had real social and ceremonial significance. In 2014, they were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is not fringe archaeology. This is mainstream scholarship carefully assembled over decades. We'll spend real time there, because the Diquis case is where the most can actually be said with confidence. The how of their manufacture, the where of their placement, the what of the labour involved, the why as best as anyone has been able to determine. Then we're going to move outward carefully, and the word carefully matters here. There are stone spheres in Scotland that are much older and much smaller, carved from sandstone and other materials, with a completely different cultural context and a very different set of open questions. There are round stones associated with Easter Island that exist in the shadow of the more famous Moai statues. There is a site in Bosnia where someone has claimed to have found the largest stone sphere ever discovered, and where the scientific debate is sharp and unresolved and worth understanding honestly. We'll go to all of those places and look at what the evidence actually supports, because not every round stone is the same mystery, and treating them as if they are does a disservice to each one. Here is the thing about perfection that makes these objects so difficult to shake once you've actually seen photographs of them or read the measurements. A sphere is geometrically demanding. It is one of the most precisely defined shapes in mathematics. Every point on the surface is supposed to be exactly the same distance from the center. When you try to achieve that in stone, by hand, without a lathe, without digital calipers, without any of the tools that modern manufacturing takes for granted, the margin for error compounds at every step. A slight wobble in your grinding motion, a small inconsistency in the hardness of the material, a miscalculation in how much you've removed from one side, and the sphere becomes not quite a sphere. It becomes a very good ball, but not the thing these people apparently made. The largest Diquis spheres have been measured to within 2% of perfect. Some researchers put certain examples even closer than that. When you hold that number against the conditions under which they were made, the tropical heat, the physical exhaustion of working gabbro with stone tools, the absence of any written geometric system that we know of, that 2% figure stops feeling like a limitation and starts feeling almost inexplicable. Almost, not quite. Because humans have a long history of achieving things that look inexplicable until you sit with the process long enough to understand what sustained effort and accumulated knowledge actually makes possible. We'll come back to that. For now, the important thing is the shape of what we're doing tonight. We're following the evidence where it leads. We're asking what is known, what is debated, and what is genuinely unknown, and we're trying to be honest about which category each claim belongs in. We're not going to tell you these spheres prove ancient contact between civilizations that had no other evidence of connection. We're not going to tell you they're the work of a lost technology no modern researcher can account for. But we're also not going to pretend they're simple, because they are not simple. If they were simple, they would not still be the subject of active archaeological inquiry. They would not still be the thing that makes people who see them in person go quiet for a moment and just look. So find somewhere comfortable, let the rest of the day go. We're going to take our time with this one. Starting in a river delta in southern Costa Rica, where someone, a long time ago, picked up a piece of stone that had come down from the mountains and decided to make it round. Perfectly, stubbornly, mysteriously round. Think for a moment about what a sphere actually requires of you. Not a ball that feels round in your hand, not a stone worn smooth by river water, not something that rolls when you push it and is good enough. A true sphere. The mathematical kind, where the surface at every point maintains the same relationship to the centre, where no axis is privileged over any other, where the shape looks identical regardless of which way you rotate it. That object, when you try to make it deliberately by removing material from raw stone, forces you to solve a problem that compounds on itself in every direction simultaneously. This is why the choice of a sphere is worth pausing on before we go any further. Because it is not the obvious choice. It is not even close to the obvious choice. If you are trying to display power, you could carve a face. Cultures around the world did exactly that. You could carve an animal, a weapon, a human figure, a geometric pattern on a flat surface. You could build something tall, something long, something with straight lines that declares intentionality just by existing. Any of those would communicate that skilled labour had been applied to raw material. Any of those would announce that someone had resources and time and expertise, and any of those, frankly, would be easier to make than a sphere. Not easy. Easier. There is a difference. So why a sphere specifically? That question is more interesting than it first appears, and it does not have a single clean answer. Part of the answer is visibility. A sphere has no front and no back, no direction it is facing, no angle from which it reads as incomplete or turned away from you. Place it in an open space and it presents itself equally to every observer regardless of where they are standing. It is, in a sense, maximally visible from every direction at once. For objects that seem to have been placed at sites of social or ceremonial gathering, that property matters. Everyone in the space has the same relationship to the object. No one is standing behind it, receiving a lesser version of it. That is not a small thing when you're thinking about what a physical object communicates in a shared space. There's also the symmetry itself, which many cultures across time have treated as inherently meaningful. Symmetry reads, at some deep perceptual level, as intentionality. It says something made this. Not weather, not time, not accident. Something with purpose. A naturally rounded stone has a kind of symmetry, but it carries the story of its own erosion in its irregularities. A deliberately shaped sphere carries a different message. It says the irregularities were removed. It says someone decided the shape was wrong and corrected it, over and over until the shape was right. That is a statement of will as much as it is a demonstration of skill. But before we talk too much about what the shape means, we need to be precise about something that archaeologists take seriously and that popular accounts often blur past: the difference between a stone that looks round and a stone that was made to be a sphere. This distinction matters more than it might seem. River stones can be remarkably round. Concretions, which are naturally occurring mineral formations, can produce near-perfect spheres through geological processes that have nothing to do with human hands. There are beaches in New Zealand called the Moeraki boulders, where geological concretions have formed large, nearly spherical shapes that regularly prompt questions from visitors who assume something deliberate must have produced them. Nothing deliberate did. The Earth made them over millions of years through mineral accretion around a nucleus. So how do archaeologists tell the difference? This is where the actual diagnostic work comes in, and it is worth understanding because it is the foundation of the claims that matter. The first thing researchers look for is tool marks. When a human being removes material from stone using another piece of stone, a process called pecking, it leaves a distinctive surface texture. The marks are not random the way erosion marks are. They cluster, they repeat, they show directionality. Under the right light and magnification, the evidence of deliberate work is readable on the surface of the stone. The Diquis spheres show this. The surface texture is not the texture of natural erosion. It is the texture of sustained, directed, human effort. The second diagnostic is the finishing process. Most deliberately shaped stone objects go through stages. There is rough shaping, which removes large amounts of material relatively quickly. Then there is refining, which addresses the larger irregularities. Then there is grinding, which uses abrasive materials to smooth the surface and bring the shape closer to the intended form. Then, in some cases, there is polishing, which creates a surface that reflects light in a way raw stone does not. The Diquis spheres show evidence of grinding and in some cases polishing. That sequence does not happen by accident. It is a craft sequence, and it is legible to researchers who know what to look for. The third thing is material analysis. Where did the stone come from? If a sphere is made from a material that does not occur naturally at the site where it was found, that is evidence of transport, which is itself evidence of intentionality. People do not move several tons of stone across a river system and through dense jungle unless they have decided to. The gabbro used in the Diquis spheres was quarried in mountains miles away from where the finished spheres ended up. That is not an accident of geology. That is a decision someone made and then carried out through significant organized effort. Now. The question of how difficult this actually is Gabbro is a hard, igneous rock. It is not soft. It does not yield easily to stone tools. To shape it into a sphere, the people making it would have needed to work in 3 dimensions simultaneously, constantly rotating the object, constantly checking the shape from multiple angles, removing material carefully and evenly across the entire surface, without creating a flat spot on one side or an elongation along one axis. This is the part that gets described, sometimes breathlessly, as impossible. It is not impossible, but it is genuinely demanding, and here is why the demand is interesting rather than mysterious. The difficulty is not in the raw physical labour, though that was certainly substantial. The difficulty is in the mental model. To shape something into a true sphere without modern measuring tools, you need to carry the shape in your head with precision. You need to be able to assess deviation from the ideal by eye, by touch, by the way the object behaves when you roll it, and you need to translate that assessment into corrective action that addresses the deviation without introducing a new one somewhere else. That is a skill that takes time to develop. It takes teaching and learning across generations. It takes a tradition of practice that accumulates knowledge about the work. That is not lost technology. That is craft knowledge, and craft knowledge can develop and also be lost when the communities that held it no longer exist or no longer practice it. The absence of that knowledge today does not mean it required something other than human skill and human time to produce. It means we are not those people living in that tradition, having spent our lives learning that particular way of working with that particular material. Where things go wrong in popular accounts of objects like these is in the leap from impressive to inexplicable. Impressive craftsmanship does not require a supernatural explanation, a lost civilization, or technology that left no other trace. It requires people who are very good at something and had good reasons to be. The Diquis spheres are impressive, genuinely, measurably, stubbornly impressive. But impressive things have been made by human beings working within the limits of their actual tools and knowledge throughout the entire span of human history. The question is not whether it was possible. The question is what the conditions were that made it not just possible but worth doing. And that question, the why of it, the social and symbolic and political reasons, a particular group of people in a particular place at a particular time decided that hard stone should be made perfectly round. That is actually the more interesting question, because the answer to that question tells you something about who they were, not just what they could do, but what they cared about, what they wanted to say, who they were saying it to. We are going to spend a lot of time with that question as this story unfolds. But first, we should go to the place itself, the Diquis Delta in the wet lowlands of southern Costa Rica, where the spheres were found in the greatest numbers in the most concentrated spaces, and where the archaeology is developed enough to give us something real to work with. That is where the evidence is thickest. That is where we start. The Diquis Delta today is the kind of place where things grow whether you want them to or not. It is low, flat land in the far south of Costa Rica, close to where the country narrows toward Panama. To the west is the Pacific. To the east, hills and mountains that feed rivers down into the plain. For much of the year, it is hot, wet, and overwhelmingly green. Before the 20th century, this was a landscape of floodplain forest, mangroves, and river channels that moved and braided over time. It was not empty. It was inhabited by people who had been there, in one cultural form or another, for thousands of years. Archaeologists call the broader cultural setting the Diquis subregion of the Greater Chiriquí area. That label covers a sequence of societies that occupied southern Costa Rica and western Panama from roughly the 1st millennium BCE through the arrival of Europeans. Within that arc, the period that matters most for the spheres is late, the so-called Chiriquí or Baruca phases, roughly from about 700 or 800 CE up to contact in the 16th century. This was not a single kingdom with written records and palace walls. It was a mosaic of chiefdoms, each organized around powerful lineages, ritual specialists, and networks of alliance and rivalry. These communities lived in villages and small towns strung along river terraces and ridges, with some sites functioning as regional centres. They cultivated maize, beans, and other crops. They worked gold and copper into ornaments. They built earthen mounds and paved areas with river cobbles. They buried their dead with care and with grave goods. In other words, this was a complex stratified society with enough surplus and organisation to support specialised craft production and large communal projects. It is in this setting, not in a vacuum, that we meet the spheres. The first thing to understand about the Diquis spheres is that they are not all the same. They are not a single, monolithic category of identical objects. They exist on a spectrum. At the small end, there are stones only a few centimetres across, fist-sized or smaller, that you could hold in one hand. At the large end, there are giants, spheres more than 2 metres in diameter, weighing several tons, made from dense, dark, igneous rock. Most fall somewhere between 30 centimetres and 1.5 metres. The variety in size matters, because it suggests a range of uses, contexts, and perhaps meanings, rather than one singular function uniformly applied. Materially, the majority that have been studied are made of gabbro. Gabbro is a coarse-grained, intrusive, igneous rock, similar in composition to basalt but formed deeper in the Earth's crust, cooling slowly so its minerals grow larger. It is tough and heavy, with a dark grey to black colour when freshly broken, weathering lighter over time. A smaller number of spheres are made from other stones, sandstone for example, and in a few cases a limestone or calcareous material, but gabbro is the signature. As the geological work has traced that gabbro to specific sources in the nearby hills, the Phylogicera and related formations, where outcrops and boulders could have been quarried or selected. The sites where the largest concentrations of spheres have been documented, such as Finca 6, Batambal, Grijalba 2, and El Silencio, lie down on the floodplain several kilometres away. So you have a chain, raw material in the uplands, finished objects in the lowlands. That alone is a clue to deliberate planning and transport. Then there is the question people love to ask. How many are there, and how perfect are they? If you read popular articles or watch sensationalized videos, you will often see numbers like over 300 or up to 500 spheres, sometimes more, paired with claims that they are mathematically perfect to within a few millimetres. Those statements mix documented information with rumour and a generous amount of rounding up. The careful counts, based on archaeological surveys and museum records, usually land in the low hundreds. Around 300 distinct spheres and fragments have been recorded from the Diquis region in academic publications. The number is imprecise because many were moved before anyone documented them properly. Some have been broken, and some exist only in old photographs or second-hand reports. There may have been more. There is no solid basis, however, for confidently stating a much larger figure like 1,000 as a proven fact. As for their perfectness, measurements exist for a sample of spheres, and they are impressive but not magical. Many of the larger gabbro spheres deviate from a true mathematical sphere by a few millimetres to a few centimetres over diameters of more than a metre. Some are more irregular, especially those made of softer or more friable rock. Weathering, damage, and later reworking also complicate the picture. The takeaway is that the best examples are very well made by human, hand tool standards, especially given their size and material. They are not Platonic ideals of sphericity conjured out of stone with no error whatsoever. The craft is extraordinary without needing to be impossible. Part of the confusion comes from the way these objects entered wider public awareness, which had nothing to do with careful archaeology at first, and everything to do with bananas. In the 1930s and 1940s, the United Fruit Company expanded its plantations into the Diquis Delta. To make room for rows of banana plants, workers cleared forest, drained swamps, and bulldozed mounds and terraces that had stood for centuries. As they cut and burned and levelled the land, they began to uncover large stone balls. Some were half buried in old soil layers. Some sat in lines or clusters on low earthen platforms. To plantation managers, they were curiosities and obstacles. To workers, they quickly became objects of rumour. Stories spread that the spheres contained gold. Men drilled into them, blasted them with dynamite, or tried to split them open in search of treasure that was not there. Some were rolled aside, pushed into ditches, or incorporated into garden landscaping. Others were transported to town squares, private yards, or company offices as ornaments. Only gradually did a handful of Costa Rican scholars and visiting archaeologists realize that a major pre-Columbian phenomenon was being disrupted in front of them. That early phase left a permanent mark. It destroyed context that would have been invaluable for understanding original placement and use. It scattered spheres far from where they were first set, and it generated a cloud of half-remembered anecdotes. There were dozens in that field. We found a line of them over there that still surface in conversations and media accounts. Sorting out which of those stories correspond to real, documentable objects and which are exaggerations or conflations is part of why the numbers remain blurry. Despite that damage, the Diquis Delta remains the strongest, clearest case in the world for a sustained tradition of carving large stone spheres. It is the strongest case because of quantity. Nowhere else on Earth have so many deliberate archaeological stone spheres been found in such a relatively compact region. It is the strongest case because of context. At sites like Finca 6 and Batambal, spheres have been documented in situ, still standing on earthen platforms, arranged in lines and groupings that correlate with architectural features and burial areas. They are not isolated oddities. They are integrated into built landscapes. It is also the strongest case because of the level of scholarly attention. Costa Rican archaeologists and their collaborators have spent decades mapping sites, excavating, documenting remaining contexts, analysing rock sources, and in some cases reuniting displaced spheres with their original settings. In 2014, 4 of the main sites were inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Property under the name Pre-Columbian Chiefdom Settlements, with stone spheres of the Diquis, reflecting the growing body of research that situates the spheres within a broader pattern of monumental architecture and social complexity. That designation did something important. It shifted the conversation from mysterious stone balls that shouldn't exist to monuments created by known, local societies whose material culture we can study. It did not answer every question. It didn't tell us definitively why a particular sphere was placed on a particular platform, but it gave us a framework grounded in excavation data, radiocarbon dates from associated features, and comparative analysis with other sites in the region. When we talk about stone spheres elsewhere in the world, in Bosnia, in the Pacific, in odd corners of Europe, we are often dealing with scattered finds, ambiguous geology, and limited documentation. The temptation is to tie them all together into one global puzzle. The Diquis spheres remind us to start from the ground up instead, with place, with context, with the people who actually lived there. In the Diquis Delta, we have that grounding. We can walk the same river terraces, trace the lines of platforms where spheres once stood in ordered rows, and recover the pottery sherds, metal objects, and charcoal traces that anchor those arrangements in time. That is why this is the best laboratory we have for understanding how, when, and why such objects could be made. To answer those questions responsibly, though, we need to know not just what the spheres look like now, but how old they really are. and that means turning to something people often skip over because it feels technical: how you date a tradition that left no inscriptions and almost no organic material attached directly to the stones themselves. Stone feels timeless, but that is a bit of an illusion. If you pick up a gabbro sphere in the Diquis Delta and ask, "How old is this?" there is no test that will simply answer you the way a barcode scanner does in a supermarket. That is especially true for the method people hear about most: radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon works on things that were once alive: charcoal from a hearth, a piece of wood from a house post, seeds, bone, cloth, even residue stuck to the inside of a pot. These contain carbon that was cycling through the atmosphere, taken up by plants, eaten by animals, fixed into flesh. When those organisms die, the radioactive isotope carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. Measure how much is left compared to the stable forms of carbon, and you can estimate how long it has been since that bit of organic matter stopped exchanging carbon with the air. A block of gabbro does not do that. It is igneous rock, solidified from molten material long before any humans were around to carve it. Its age, in geological terms, is millions of years. The act of shaping it into a sphere does not reset any clock that radiocarbon can see. So you cannot take a core from the center of a stone ball, run it through a lab, and get a date like 1100 CE. Archaeologists know this, of course. When they talk about dating the spheres, what they're really talking about is dating the human activities that surrounded them. That is where association comes in. Imagine walking up to an undisturbed platform at Finca 6. On top of the low earthen mound sits a gabrosphere, still resting in the shallow bed prepared for it. Around the base of the mound there are traces of cobble pavements and post holes where wooden structures once stood. Nearby there are burials. The fill of the platform itself is layered: older soil at the bottom, then a construction layer of redeposited earth and stone, then a surface that shows wear and repair. None of that is stone. Much of it contains tiny bits of organic material: charcoal from the fires people lit while they were building, fragments of burnt wood from posts that once supported roofs, occasionally carbonized seeds or other plant remains. These can be sampled and dated. So can bones from burials that are clearly part of the same construction phase as the platform. In addition, there are artifacts: sherds of pottery, broken tools, decorative items, all mixed into the layers above, below, or level with the sphere's placement. Ceramic styles change over time in this region, and archaeologists have spent decades building relative chronologies for the greater Cherokee area. Particular forms, pastes and decorations cluster in specific periods: early, middle, late. When you find a sphere set on a platform that is sealed by pottery belonging to, say, the Cherokee phase, you can confidently say the sphere was in use during or before that phase, not centuries later. The ground itself helps. Archaeologists pay close attention to stratigraphy, the sequence of layers in the soil. If a sphere is sitting on a prepared surface that cuts through older strata but is covered by later deposits, it belongs to that middle moment. If it is embedded in an occupation layer that also contains datable materials, it is part of that occupation. If a later feature, like a colonial ditch, slices past it, you know it predates that. Taken together, these lines of evidence allow what is sometimes called association dating. You're not dating the rock, you're dating the architectural features, the settlement phases, the life of the site in which the rock was given its special shape and place. At Finca 6 and other key sites, this approach has produced a fairly consistent story. Radiocarbon dates from associated features, combined with ceramic typologies and settlement patterns, point to the main period of sphere use falling between about 800 and 1500 CE. with a concentration in the centuries just before Spanish contact. Some spheres may have been put in place a little earlier, in the late first millennium CE. Some may have remained visible and meaningful into the early colonial period, but there is no good evidence that the Diquis spheres are thousands of years older than the surrounding chiefdom societies, or that they belong to some lost civilization predating the rest of the region's archaeology. Within that general range, though, important details are still debated. One question is whether the tradition of carving and placing spheres emerged suddenly in the late Cherokee phase, or developed gradually from earlier practices that left fewer clear traces. Another is whether all the large gabbro spheres belong to a relatively tight time window, perhaps coinciding with the peak of certain regional centres, or whether different communities were making them off and on over several centuries. Part of the difficulty is that only a fraction of the known spheres are still in original contexts where careful stratigraphic work is even possible. The rest have had their stories scrambled. The banana expansion that first exposed the spheres also tore many of them away from their archaeological anchors. Bulldozers cut through platforms and mounds, pushing stones into piles or drainage ditches. Workers rolled spheres across fields or loaded them onto trucks with chains and winches. Some were set up outside company offices, in town plazas, or later in front of schools and municipal buildings. Others ended up in private gardens, hotel courtyards, and traffic circles. Looting added another layer of confusion. In the mid-20th century, as word of the spheres spread, collectors sought them out. People dug into mounds hoping to find gold beneath or inside them, breaking the architecture around them and destroying any chance of reading the original sequence of construction and use. Records of these moves were rarely kept in a way archaeologists could use later. "We pulled that one from the back of the finca" is not a GPS coordinate or a stratigraphic section. The result is a strong preservation bias. The spheres that stayed where they were, especially those at sites later protected and excavated, are the ones that tell us the most about timing and context. They sit on intact platforms, in alignments that can be mapped against house foundations, burial areas, and pathways. They yield radiocarbon samples from sealed layers. They can be tied to settlement phases defined across the region. The spheres that were moved into gardens and plazas, by contrast, are effectively floating in time. You can analyze their rock, measure their size, compare their surface finish to better dated examples, and make educated guesses. But without their original architectural and stratigraphic surroundings, it is hard to know whether a particular relocated sphere came from an early or late phase of the tradition, or whether it once stood in a central ceremonial space or at the edge of a smaller hamlet. This bias affects not just our sense of dates, but our overall picture of the phenomenon. If more robustly carved gabbro spheres, for example, survived moving better than smaller or softer ones, we might be undercounting certain categories that once existed. If spheres from elite centres were more likely to be taken as prestige objects, our sample in modern collections might tilt toward the monumental and away from the everyday. Despite these complications, the broad outline holds. Through association dating, strata, ceramics, architecture and settlement phases, the Diquis spheres resolve into a late pre-Columbian tradition rooted firmly in the societies that built the mounds and cobble pavements around them. They are not undatable anomalies. Once you accept that, a new kind of question becomes possible. If these spheres belong to the final centuries before European contact, made by people we can otherwise recognize in the archaeological record, then we can start to ask, with less guesswork and more precision, how such heavy, stubborn stones were actually shaped into near-perfect curves in the first place. If you start from that premise, that these are late pre-Columbian works, not relics of some unknown deep time, then the mystery changes flavour. Instead of, who on earth could have done this, the question becomes, given the tools and materials we know they had, what would the actual step-by-step process of making a stone sphere look like? Archaeologists like to borrow a French term for this, the chaîne opératoire, the operational chain. The idea is to think through each link in the sequence, from raw material in the ground to finished object in its final resting place. For the Diquis spheres, it probably begins in the hills that rise behind the delta. The largest balls are carved from gabbro, a hard, coarse-grained igneous rock that outcrops in specific ridges and knolls. Smaller examples can be made of sandstone or other, slightly softer stones. Either way, someone had to go looking. They needed to know where usable rock stood close enough to the surface that it could be quarried without metal tools or explosives. You can imagine a party of workers and specialists walking the slopes, reading the landscape the way a stonemason reads a fresh cut. They would be looking for boulders and bedrock faces with the right size, the right internal structure, the right lack of major cracks that might cause a half-finished piece to split. Once a promising mass of gabbro was selected, the first task was to detach a workable block. With no iron wedges or steel chisels, the likely methods are simple, but time-tested. You hit rock with other rock. You take advantage of natural fractures. You exploit fire and water to weaken the surface and then strike. In experimental work on similar stones, researchers have used harder cobbles as hammerstones, dense river pebbles of quartzite or other tough materials to peck grooves along a desired break line. Repeated blows along that line, combined with wooden or stone wedges driven into small cracks, can gradually separate a big lump of rock from its parent. This is exhausting work, but not impossible. Given steady labour, a small crew can remove sizable blocks using nothing more exotic than stone hammers and patience. Once a rough block was freed, the next link in the chain was shaping it into something that could plausibly become a sphere. Here, the goal is not perfection, it is to remove the most obviously unwanted material. You want to turn an irregular mass into a rough polyhedron or ovoid that, when rotated, can be refined from all directions. Pecking is the main technique. You take a hammerstone and strike the surface of the gabbro in a controlled way, chipping off small flakes. The impacts leave a dimpled, bruised surface. Work all around the block, knocking down corners, filling in hollows, and over time the outlines begin to curve. Experimental archaeology on Costa Rican materials suggests that, with a well-chosen hammerstone and a consistent rhythm, it is possible to remove several litres of rock per hour in this fashion. The first rough-out stage, where you're still knocking off big protrusions, would have been relatively quick compared to the finer finishing stages. Days or weeks of intermittent work by a focused team could carry a large block into recognisably spherical territory. From there, things slow down. Once the basic form exists, every hit matters more. A single heavy blow in the wrong place can leave a flat facet or a deep pit that takes hours to erase. So the pecking becomes finer, the hammerstones lighter, the attention more careful. Workers would have constantly shifted their stance, rotated the stone and compared different profiles. One simple trick used in modern experiments is to squat low and let your eye trace the silhouette of the ball against the horizontal line of the ground or the horizon. Wherever the rock bulges above that imagined circle, you concentrate your efforts. Wherever it cuts in, you leave it alone. As the surface approached a true curve, grinding joined pecking. Grinding is essentially controlled abrasion. You rub one stone against another with sand and water in between. In the Diquis region, riverbed supplied abundant sand and rounded cobbles. A half-finished sphere could be rolled or levered so that different zones were in contact with the grinding stone. Water both lubricated and carried away the powdered rock. Over time, the sharp microfractures left by pecking were smoothed, the high points levelled down to meet the slightly lower valleys. The final visible step on the most carefully finished spheres was polishing. At this stage, the goal was not to change the overall shape, but to reduce surface roughness until the rock took on a low sheen. Finer sands, clay, or even plant-based abrasives might have been used. The work is more like burnishing than carving. A hand-sized stone or shard of a different rock could be rubbed over the surface in small circles, again and again, until the light slid evenly over the curve. All of this can be done with tools that we know are available. No steel, no diamond bits, no secret alloy. Just harder cobbles, hammerstones of different sizes, grinding slabs, sand, water, and time. So what about the claim that these spheres are too perfect to be produced with such simple means? The phrase sounds impressive, but it hides an important question. How perfect is too perfect? Careful measurements of Diquis spheres that are still in good condition show a range of accuracies. Some are within a few millimeters of a perfect sphere across diameters of 1 or 2 meters. Others deviate by a centimeter or more. A few are distinctly out of round, more like slightly squashed balls or eggs. To quantify this, researchers measure multiple diameters across different axes, north-south, east-west, and several diagonals, and compare them. They also use contour gauges and, in recent work, 3D scanning to model the entire surface. The results suggest that many spheres achieve a level of regularity comparable to what a modern craftsperson could do by hand with simple tools, given enough practice and motivation. In other words, they are very good, but not mathematically perfect. There is no sign that they match each other to sub-millimeter tolerances, or that they encode some universal standard of measure with laser-like precision. They look astonishing to the naked eye, especially in the humid light of the delta. But when you treat them as measured objects, you see the human hand in them. Tiny flat spots, slight differences, the record of choices and adjustments over hours and days of work. Those hours and days matter because they tell us something about labour and organisation. How long would it take to make one of the big gabbro spheres? Estimates vary because they depend on assumptions. How many people are working at once? How many hours per day they can devote to the task? What level of finish is desired? How skilled they are? Experimental projects using hard, igneous rock and replica tools suggest that bringing a 1-meter diameter stone from raw block to well-smooth sphere could easily consume hundreds of person-days of effort. Scaling up to the largest known Diquis spheres, which approach 2.5 meters across and weigh several tons, you're dealing with an investment that might span months of intermittent work for a crew, or a sustained focus by a small team of specialists over a season. That kind of labour is not something a lone hobbyist undertakes in secret. It implies social structures capable of freeing people from everyday subsistence tasks long enough to quarry, shape, and finish heavy stone monuments. Food has to be supplied, tools have to be renewed, knowledge of technique has to be transmitted from experienced carvers to younger apprentices. We see hints of this in the archaeological record. At some sites, there are concentrations of broken gabbro, flakes, and partially worked stones that may represent workshops or at least staging areas. A few unfinished spheres still attached to bedrock have been reported, suggesting that not every project was completed or moved. Where tools have been collected systematically, clusters of battered hammerstones with characteristic wear patterns appear alongside the debitage. Even so, the evidence is patchy. Banana agriculture and later development heavily disturbed the very places where carving was likely most intense. To really nail down the chaîne opératoire, archaeologists would like to find more intact workshop zones, quarries with clear extraction scars, piles of flakes radiating away from a central working surface, caches of worn-out hammerstones, and half-finished spheres that stalled at different stages. Each of these would capture a moment in the life of a sphere. The blow that cracked off a corner, the groove that started a curve, the abandoned surface that shows exactly how far the workers had gotten before something intervened. Taken together, That is what would turn a plausible reconstruction into a well-grounded one. For now, the operational chain we can outline, quarry, rough out, peck, grind, polish, is built from a combination of direct finds, experimental replication, and comparison with stoneworking traditions elsewhere in the world. It does not require lost technologies or unknown materials. It does require time, coordination, and a cultural decision that turning stubborn rock into almost impossibly smooth curves was worth all that effort. Once that decision was made, the next challenge was just as demanding, moving many tons of carefully shaped stone across a wet, low-lying landscape, without cracking or scarring the precious surface you'd just spent so long perfecting. The landscape those finished spheres had to cross was not a dry, firm plain. The Diquis Delta is a place of water. Even today, with drainage canals and raised roads, it is a patchwork of rivers, seasonally flooded flats, and low ridges that only stand a few meters above the wet ground. Before modern engineering, the contrast would have been even starker. In the rainy season, wide areas turned to swamp, channels shifted, small streams could become impassable torrents. The vegetation was and is dense. Tall grasses, thickets, patches of forest, roots and trunks that snag anything trying to move through. This matters because stone spheres are unforgiving cargo. Once you've invested hundreds of person days in carving and polishing a boulder, you cannot simply drag it wherever is convenient and accept a few scratches. Deep gouges, chips, or cracks are almost impossible to remove without reworking large areas of the surface. So whatever transport system was used had to cope not only with weight, but with protection of the object. When people first encounter photographs of the spheres, they often imagine the simplest of all possibilities. You just roll them, and there is some truth in that. A sphere is naturally mobile. On suitably firm, relatively smooth ground, 1 or 2 dozen people with poles and ropes can make a multi-ton ball creep forward, a few handspans at a time. Once in motion, the load can be kept going with less effort than it took to start. There are ethnographic examples from other regions where heavy cylindrical or rounded stones were moved this way, but a raw roll over rough soil and scattered rock would quickly leave scars. So you almost certainly want some mediation between the sphere and the ground. One practical option is to roll the sphere over a prepared trackway, a path cleared of obstacles, perhaps sprinkled with sand or laid with planks or brush. Even a thin layer of organic material can soften contact points, while sand helps distribute pressure. The track might be slightly crowned or banked to keep the sphere from wandering off to the side. Ropes tied around the stone, or pass through a cradle or sling under it, let teams control speed on downhill stretches and prevent runaway accidents. Another family of solutions treats the sphere not as something to roll, but as something to sledge. A sledge is essentially a platform or skid. You rest the stone on wooden runners, perhaps cushioned with fibre and leaves to preserve the polish, and then drag the whole assembly. This introduces more friction than direct rolling, but it also spreads the load over a wider area. In a wet landscape, that is crucial. Narrow contact points sink. Broad runners float a little. If you put round logs crosswise under the sledge, you get the classic log roller system. The platform rides on turning cylinders, while crews at the back continuously retrieve the spent logs and relay them in front. Experimental work in many parts of the world, including with stones of comparable weight, shows that such setups dramatically reduce the force needed to move a load, especially over short, rough stretches. In swampier zones, people might have exploited water itself as an aid rather than an obstacle. A stone sphere placed on a sturdy, wide, canoe-like raft displaces water according to its mass. With enough buoyant volume, the effective weight on the supports is reduced to manageable levels. Rivers and canals then become highways, not barriers. There is no direct textual record of such rafts for the Diquis period, but pre-Columbian peoples throughout the region used dugout canoes and understood riverine travel intimately. Scaling that knowledge up to slow, careful movement of heavy cargo is not a wild stretch. Seasonal timing would be essential. In the heart of the rainy season, currents are strong and banks unstable. In the dry months, water levels drop, exposing mudflats and sandbars. Somewhere between those extremes, there is a window where channels are full enough to float a heavy raft, but not so violent as to threaten to overturn it. It is easy to imagine elders and specialists knowing exactly when that window opened each year. Archaeologists cannot watch any of these methods being used in the Diquis Delta 1,000 years ago. What they can do is work backward from stone and soil. One line of evidence comes from geology. The gabbro used for many spheres does not occur everywhere. It appears in specific belts and outcrops. By mapping those out and comparing them with the locations where finished spheres have been found, researchers can propose likely movement corridors. If a cluster of spheres in a former settlement lies 10 kilometers from the nearest suitable gabbro source, and that gap is crossed by a particular ridge system or river, that ridge or river immediately becomes suspect as a route. Where multiple sites line up along the same topographic feature, a pattern begins to emerge. Perhaps a favoured ridge road, perhaps a recurrent crossing point where a tributary was narrow and stable. Another clue is the distribution of unfinished or damaged stones. If partly worked spheres cluster near the hills, while more polished examples appear further out in the valley, it suggests that fine finishing often happened closer to the final destination, after the rough mass had been moved. That makes sense from a risk management perspective. You want to do as little high investment surface work as possible before subjecting the piece to the hazards of transport. Conversely, if some spheres at quarries are almost finished yet never moved, it might indicate staging grounds that doubled as ceremonial sites, or projects interrupted by shifting priorities, disaster, or social change. In the best cases, archaeologists can pair these spatial patterns with traces on the ground. Faint linear mounds or ditches, old causeways, sometimes show up under modern fields. Slightly raised strips crossing low, flood-prone ground may be remnants of ancient paths built to stay above the worst of the seasonal water. Today, many are ploughed, graded, or overprinted by plantation infrastructure, but aerial imagery and LIDAR have begun to reveal subtle alignments that connect high ground to former habitation mounds and sphere groups. No one feature proves a specific sphere was dragged down a specific causeway, but each overlapping line of evidence, rock source, sphere cluster, path remnant, makes the picture sharper. Whatever the exact routes, moving a multi-ton stone was not a quiet private act. It takes bodies, dozens of them, people to pull on ropes, to push with poles, to steer, to wedge logs, to lay down brush in front of runners, to call out rhythm and warnings, others to bring food and water, children watching from the edges, elders advising when to wait out a rainburst or shift to higher ground. In many traditional societies, such undertakings become events, part Labour Party, part ritual, part performance of community strength. Songs keep the pullers in time. Feasting marks each milestone reached. The stone is not just an object being moved, it is the focus around which social energy is organized. We cannot know the exact songs or stories that accompanied a Diquis sphere as it inched across the delta. But the scale of the job tells us something about the kind of community that undertook it, coordinated, able to marshal labour on demand, and willing to pour that labour into a shared project that left a lasting mark on the land. This is also where it helps to keep the logistics grounded, because modern retellings often do the opposite. You will sometimes hear that the spheres are so heavy and the terrain so difficult that no amount of human effort could have moved them. Therefore, something extraordinary must be invoked. Advanced machines, perhaps, or lost technologies that leave no trace. Those claims usually glide over basic factors like friction, leverage, and the difference between dragging a stone over bare rock and sliding it over wet, compressible ground on wide runners. They ignore that people elsewhere moved monoliths of similar or greater mass over longer distances, in environments just as challenging, with no recourse to anything beyond wood, fibre, and muscle. They also skip the very specific geography of the Diquis region. This is not a valley walled by cliffs. It is a mosaic of low hills, riverbanks, and floodplains where, with some planning, you can stitch together routes that exploit every bit of solid ground and every manageable stretch of water. None of this makes the achievement trivial. It remains a formidable feat of planning and persistence, but it does pull it back into a world where careful measurement, patient experiment, and attention to landscape are enough to explain how stone moved. Once those spheres arrived, without being shattered, without being scarred so badly that all the polishing had to be redone, the next question is just as intriguing. Where exactly were they placed? And what does that pattern of placement suggest about how the people of the Diquis Delta understood space, power, and the presence of these impossibly smooth stones in everyday life? When archaeologists first started mapping where the spheres actually turned up, a quiet pattern began to emerge. They were not scattered randomly across the landscape like lost cargo. They were clustered, chosen spots, chosen arrangements. In the Diquis Delta, many spheres were found on or near artificial mounds, low, carefully built platforms of earth that once supported houses, public buildings, or ritual spaces. Some were set at the foot of these mounds, some on their flanks, some crowning the top. Even when the mound itself had been ploughed flat for banana plantations, the denser subsoil and the positions of post holes give away the original form. Again and again, a sphere sits right where a visitor's path would have brought them, or at the edge of a level area that once held a house of unusual size. Other spheres appear around open plazas. These plazas were not paved squares like in later colonial towns. They were simply flattened, cleared spaces in front of mounds and houses, kept relatively free of vegetation. In those spaces, the spheres sometimes appear singly, sometimes in small groups, occasionally in what look like deliberate lines or arcs. A few sites show rows of spheres leading from a plaza toward another mound group, like a stony procession route. A third recurring context is what archaeologists cautiously call elite residences. At sites where the architecture is more substantial, larger platforms, heavier posts, more imported or high-status materials, spheres are more likely to show up close by. That does not prove that only high-status people could own or commission spheres, but the association is suggestive. In settlement layouts reconstructed from post holes and mound remnants, the spheres tend to hug the central, architecturally rich core, not the scattered smaller houses out on the periphery. If you step back and look at entire sites, another layer emerges, the relationship between spheres and the overall layout of the settlement. Some Diquis sites show concentric organization, central plaza, ring of mounds, then more dispersed habitation beyond. Spheres cluster in that inner zone. Others are more linear, strung along a ridge or old riverbank. There, spheres tend to mark breaks in the line, the start or end of a built-up stretch, the crossing of a small gully, the point where a path likely branched. The stones seem to pay attention to edges and thresholds. This is where the discussion of alignments begins, and where it has to be handled carefully. Because when people see large stones in neat lines or patterns, the human brain immediately starts looking for cosmic purpose. Do they line up with the sunrise on a particular day, with the position of a bright star, with something in the distant landscape, a mountain peak, a river bend? Several researchers and local observers have proposed astronomical alignments for some of the Diquis sphere groups. There are claims that certain rows point toward solstice sunrises or sunsets, or that clusters encode lunar standstills. At first glance, Some of these proposals look neat. You can draw lines on a map, take compass bearings, and find angles that correspond roughly to important solar positions. But this is also where the evidence starts to thin out. Many of the spheres we see today have been moved, sometimes a short distance within the same farm, sometimes dozens of kilometers away to parks, museums, or private gardens. Others were toppled or shifted by bulldozers long before archaeologists could document their original positions. Even when a sphere appears to be in situ, the structures around it are often heavily eroded. A line that now seems to aim at the horizon might once have been responding to the corner of a mound or the edge of a building that no longer exists. There is also the problem of numbers. If you have many stones and many possible directions in the sky, some alignments will occur by chance, without a clear pattern repeated at multiple sites, and without very precise measurements anchored in firm stratigraphy. It is risky to declare that a given arrangement is certainly an observatory or calendar. That does not mean there were no astronomical considerations at all. Many agricultural societies in the tropics pay close attention to the sun and the onset of rainy seasons. It would not be surprising if certain spheres, or certain pairs of spheres, were involved in marking those cycles. But at present the hard archaeological support for elaborate, precise astronomical functions in the Diquis spheres remains limited and contested. What is better supported are more down-to-earth roles, boundaries, status markers, statements of order. Imagine walking toward a Diquis settlement along a narrow, slightly raised path that threads through low, wet ground. Ahead, the land begins to lift. Houses appear. Then, at the point where the informal countryside becomes the structured heart of the community, a smooth, impossibly regular stone rises from the ground. It would be hard not to read that as a sign that you are crossing into a different kind of space. Placed at the edge of plazas or at the front of important mounds, spheres could have acted as boundary markers, not necessarily property lines in the modern legal sense, but thresholds between ordinary and special zones, areas where rituals happened, where decisions were made, where outsiders had to behave differently. Within that central zone, the sheer labour embodied in each sphere would have made it a potent status symbol. If you can command the excavation of a boulder, its rough cutting, its slow rounding and polishing, its dangerous journey across a delta, and then its final placement in front of your residence or your community's main gathering place, you're making a quiet but unmistakable announcement. We can do this. We're organised enough, numerous enough, stable enough to pour effort into something that does not feed anyone directly. In that sense, the spheres broadcast a particular vision of order and authority. Their geometry is the opposite of the messy, flood-prone landscape around them. Where the rivers meander and the vegetation grows in tangles, the spheres impose a kind of abstract perfection. Pure curve, pure symmetry. To stand one at the centre of a plaza or at the apex of a processional route is to say that this place is not just another patch of land. It is a centre of gravity in an invisible social field. None of these roles are mutually exclusive. In fact, one of the more plausible ways to think about the spheres is as multi-use objects whose meanings shifted over generations. A stone raised by one generation to mark a founder's house might, 2 or 3 lifetimes later, be associated with a myth about that ancestor turning into stone, or with the memory of a great meeting held in its shadow. Children might have been warned not to climb on it because it was watching the community. Later still, as political structures changed, that same stone could become the focus of a new ritual, or the emblem of a lineage that claimed descent from the builders. There is also the simple fact that long-lived monuments often outlast the languages and stories that first justified them. By the time the first Spaniards entered southern Costa Rica, many of the spheres may already have been old, their original patrons long dead, their first purposes blurred. People could still attribute meaning to them, danger, luck, ancestral presence, but not necessarily the same meaning their makers intended centuries before. For archaeologists, this layered history creates particular frustration. We can often reconstruct the how of the spheres, the quarries, the tools, the transport routes, with more confidence than the why of their final placement. We see that spheres cluster near mounds, plazas, and architecturally significant structures. We see that they mark thresholds and emphasize certain lines in the settlement layout. We suspect they had to do with status, boundary, and cosmology. But the context loss is severe. Fields have been ploughed, mounds shaved down, spheres moved to decorate bank lawns and schoolyards. Oral traditions were disrupted by disease, missionization, and social collapse after contact. The subtle choreography of movement and ritual that once swirled around those stones has mostly evaporated. What remains are patterns in the dirt and suggestions in the distribution maps, enough to say that the spheres were not toys, not random garden ornaments, not the aftermath of a bored sculptor. They were placed with care in relation to the built environment and the social landscape it expressed. To get any closer to their meanings, we have to turn to the stories that grew up around them in more recent times, the myths of thunderstones and treasure, the ways modern people read these old shapes. Those stories are no substitute for the lost voices of the Diquis themselves, but they do show how powerfully a carved stone sphere can still bend imagination and action around itself, long after the society that first raised it has gone. In the centuries after those original meanings began to blur, the spheres did not simply become invisible. They slid into a different kind of story. Across much of the world, old stones with no obvious purpose attract the same kind of tales. They are thunderbolts fallen from the sky. They are giants' toys. They cover buried treasure. They're dangerous to move because someone somewhere angered them once and paid the price. The Diquis spheres were no exception. Some of the earliest accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries already report local people saying the stones were llenos de oro, full of gold. The idea took several forms. In one version, the gold was literally inside the stone, poured in through a secret opening by an earlier, richer people. In another, the gold lay underneath. The sphere was a marker placed over a cache of offerings or ingots. Either way, the logic was the same. You don't go to that much trouble just to carve a rock. There must be something more. Once that idea takes hold in a frontier economy hungry for quick wealth, the result is predictable. Farm workers and foremen on banana plantations began to experiment. If a sphere might be hollow, you needed a way to open it. Drilling was hard. Chiseling took time. Dynamite was cheap. Stories circulate of men packing charges under a sphere, lighting a fuse and running. The explosion would throw fragments across the field, sometimes shatter windows in nearby camps. What they found, over and over, was exactly what a geologist would expect. Dense, solid rock all the way through. From an archaeological perspective, each of those blasts was a small catastrophe. A single detonation did not just destroy one monument. It erased tool marks that could have told us about the finishing techniques. It scattered fragments that might have preserved pigment stains or traces of lichen growth that could help with relative dating. It removed a key point from the pattern of placements that we were just beginning to recognize. And the damage was not limited to dynamite. If you believe something valuable is hidden under a stone, you might be tempted to shift it just a little to see if the soil looks different. A lever here, a rope there. Over years, spheres that had stood in one position for centuries were nudged, rolled, or dragged. A line that had once accurately marked a threshold or a sight line became slightly crooked. A pair that had flanked a path found itself side by side in a corner of a yard. In a landscape where very few structures survive as walls or foundations, those small displacements matter. Layered over treasure hunting were more diffuse, more magical beliefs. Some people in the region came to think of the spheres as protectors. A stone in the yard was good luck, a kind of ward against misfortune. Others repeated older-sounding tales in which the stones were the work of ancient sorcerers who could soften rock with herbs or fire until it flowed like clay. A version of this motif appears from Costa Rica to Colombia, a people so powerful they could command even stone to obey. A few stories are more explicitly cosmological. Spheres as stars that fell to earth. Spheres as the eggs of a primordial serpent. Spheres as the petrified heads of enemies turned to stone. For archaeologists trying to reconstruct pre-Columbian belief systems, these modern stories are tempting. They might preserve distant echoes of ideas that were already in circulation when the spheres were young, or they might be entirely new, spun in the last few centuries and only loosely attached to the stones because they were the most conspicuous ancient objects in the neighbourhood. The problem is that we cannot tell with certainty which is which. So scholars tend to treat this folklore carefully, valuable as a record of how recent generations have related to the spheres, but not direct evidence of the intentions of their makers. Respectful listening, paired with cautious interpretation. Where the impact of modern stories becomes impossible to ignore is in the physical fate of the stones. Once the spheres acquired reputations as lucky, impressive, or simply prestigious objects, they began to be moved on purpose. Landowners placed them in front of farmhouses as signs of status. Municipalities installed them in town parks, at road junctions in front of schools. The National Museum in San Jose brought several to its courtyard, creating one of the first concentrated displays many urban Costa Ricans ever saw. Private collectors arranged them in gardens. A few even left the country, ending up in foreign museums and corporate lobbies. On one level, this increased visibility did something undeniably important. It made the spheres into national symbols. They appeared on stamps, tourist brochures, even currency. Costa Rica eventually used a stylized sphere as a visual shorthand for its pre-Columbian heritage as a whole. That recognition helped build public support for protecting the stones. It put them in front of people who might otherwise have never heard of Diquis archaeology at all. But the cost of that visibility was context. A sphere on a plinth in a museum garden is very easy to appreciate as an object. You can walk around it, admire the symmetry, feel the smoothness. What you cannot do is see the house mound it once faced, the plaza it anchored, the pattern of other stones and structures that made it part of a network. Archaeology is, at its core, about relationships in space and time. Move an artifact, even a meter or two, and you have broken some of those relationships. Move it 20 kilometers, and you have made it almost impossible to reconstruct its original role without earlier documentation. For the Diquis spheres, this process of decontextualization happened long before systematic surveys and detailed mapping were common. Many stones now displayed in prominent places were taken from sites that were barely recorded, if at all. The oral memory of where they stood and why has often faded along with the people who moved them. Recognizing this, Costa Rica and international bodies have slowly shifted their approach. In 2014, a group of pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres in the Diquis became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That designation covers not just individual stones, but the broader archaeological landscape at sites like Finca 6, Batambal, Grijalba 2 and El Silencio. The emphasis is on preserving spheres in situ within their surviving mounds, plazas and alignments. New excavations and conservation projects now tend to prioritize leaving stones where they are, stabilizing the surrounding soils, and documenting their positions with high precision. When a sphere must be moved for safety or research, the process is recorded in detail and, where possible, reversed. Heritage laws also make it harder for spheres to be exported or passed around as private garden ornaments. Many landowners who once might have treated a stone as personal property now see it as part of a shared legacy, with responsibilities attached. This does not mean that folklore and local pride are discouraged. On the contrary, many heritage programs explicitly invite community storytelling, festivals and educational projects that celebrate the spheres. But there is an effort to draw a clear line between story and claim. It is one thing to say, "My grandfather told me this stone watches over the house," and another to insist, "This stone is a coded map to a lost gold mine," and to act on that belief with shovels or explosives. Respectful folklore recognizes the stones as more than raw material or anonymous curiosities, but it does not demand that they surrender a hidden jackpot. It accepts that value can be symbolic, historical, or emotional, not just financial. Unsupported factual claims, especially when they promise secret wealth or cosmic revelations, tend to have more destructive consequences. They justify breaking, moving, or testing the stones in ways that erase the very evidence we would need to evaluate any serious hypothesis about their functions. So the challenge for both scholars and local communities is to hold two attitudes at once. On one side, a deep openness to the stories people tell about these spheres, the sense of presence they feel around them, the ways they weave them into myths of origin and protection. On the other, a disciplined insistence that when we talk about what the stones are in a historical or scientific sense, we stay close to what the material record can actually support. Between those two modes of attention, something important happens. The spheres are allowed to remain strange and powerful in the imagination, without being sacrificed to every passing fantasy about hidden chambers or alien engineers. Their surfaces can still collect new stories, while their positions in the earth, where they survive, are treated as precious data rather than obstacles in the way of a pickaxe. And from that more measured place, we can begin to ask a different kind of question. If you strip away the dynamite legends and the treasure fantasies, what kinds of worth did these stones hold for the people who first raised them? What did they signal to neighbours and strangers about the world those people thought they were building? For the people who lived with them, the spheres were never just interesting objects. They sat inside a whole fabric of things that took effort to make and effort to maintain. In the Diquis Delta, that fabric was dense. By the late first millennium CE, this was not a scattering of tiny hamlets tucked into the forest. Archaeology shows house mounds carefully raised above flood levels, drainage channels, artificial terraces, stone-lined paths. There are mortuary areas with elaborate burials, some with multiple stages of treatment. There are plazas edged with low walls. There are clusters of sculpted stones, cairns, and threaded through that built landscape the spheres. Alongside stone there was gold. Diquis goldwork is some of the most striking in Lower Central America. Tiny cast figures of humans and animals, breastplates, pendants with swirling, almost hypnotic geometry. Producing those objects required specialized knowledge, alloy recipes, lost wax casting techniques, control of heat and cooling. The metal itself had to be mined or panned, then moved over long distances. If you look at that material culture together, engineered earthworks, carved stone, worked gold, what emerges is a picture of societies that could coordinate a lot of labour and concentrate a lot of skill. The spheres fit perfectly into that picture. Each one represents quarrying, roughing out, transport, and then careful finishing. None of that happens by accident. It implies people who can tell others what to do and make it happen over weeks or months, not just an afternoon. In other words, hierarchy. Excavations at sites like Finca 6 back that up. Spheres there are not scattered anywhere a boulder would fit. They're associated with formal spaces, plaza edges, the ends of causeways, the approaches to what appear to be higher status residential areas. In some cases they stand on constructed platforms, slightly lifted above the surrounding ground. When you walk through that kind of settlement, even in ruins, you can feel how it would have communicated power. You enter along a path flanked by stones. Ahead of you rises a mound, maybe with a large house or meeting structure on top. In front or along the sides stand perfectly regular spheres that someone at some point decided were worth hauling here instead of leaving in the forest. No writing, no stone stele full of carved rulers, the way you see in the Maya lowlands. But the message would have been legible all the same. Someone owns the right to organize that much stone. Archaeologists sometimes talk about monumentality as a language. Even if you cannot read the words, you can hear the tone. A pile of casually tossed rock says one thing. A fine-faced platform with symmetrical spheres on top says another. It says, here is a center. Here live the people who can call others to work and make that work last. Control of labor is often the hidden core of elite power in non-industrial societies. You cannot hoard stocks or control factories, but you can direct hands and time. You can decide who builds the causeway, who maintains the ditches, who carries the next sphere across soggy ground to its final place. The stones in that light become frozen proof of those decisions. Every time a visitor arrived, every time a local walked past, those shapes quietly reinforced a social order. They turned invisible commands, come quarry this rock, come help roll it, into visible, enduring forms. That does not exclude other meanings. People are rarely motivated only by displays of rank, but it does anchor the spheres in a world where status mattered, where some lineages or chiefs or ritual specialists had more authority than others and needed ways to make that difference concrete. Beyond hierarchy, there is another layer that is harder to access but very likely present, ideas about how the universe was supposed to work. Across many cultures, roundness carries a particular weight. It is an easy shape to see as complete. No corners, no obvious beginning or end. A form you can spin, and from any angle, it looks the same. If you live in a place defined by cycles, the flood pulse of rivers, the return of rainy and dry seasons, planting and harvest, the recurring positions of sun, moon, and stars, it is not a stretch to imagine a sphere as a compact symbol of that pattern. The evidence from Diquis is suggestive rather than decisive. The spheres do not come with carved suns or constellations on their surfaces. They are not engraved globes, but their placements, sometimes in lines, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in careful relation to central mounds, make it plausible that they were not just marking important spots, but also helping to tell a story about order. An ordered plaza, with an ordered arrangement of perfect forms, is a strong visual metaphor for an ordered world. You can imagine these stones standing at the hinges between categories, the edge between domestic space and public space, between the realm of the living and areas reserved for the dead, between earth and sky, if certain spheres marked sight lines toward notable points on the horizon where the sun rose or set at particular times of year. There are hints of that kind of thinking elsewhere in the region. In neighbouring areas of Costa Rica and Panama, carved stone spheres appear in association with burial grounds and with sculpted figures that clearly have ritual significance. Farther afield, in Mesoamerica and the Andes, circular and spherical forms play roles in cosmology. Circular plazas, rounded altars, representations of celestial bodies. This does not mean the Diquis copied a specific model, or that everyone shared one unified cosmic diagram. It points instead to something more basic about human minds. When we try to picture wholeness, we reach for simple, closed shapes. Circles on the ground, discs in the sky, balls in the hand. When we try to anchor the idea of a reliable cycle, we are drawn to forms that can turn and return. Spheres offer that in 3 dimensions. You can see the same impulse in very different places and times. Stone balls in Neolithic Europe, round burial mounds in Japan, circular stone arrangements in southern Africa. The details differ. The underlying logic, use a simple, stable geometry to stand for something big and abstract, is common. This is part of why similar symbolism can arise independently. You do not need a ship sailing from Costa Rica to Scotland to explain why two groups of humans, both watching the same sun rise and set, might decide that round things are special. Our brains, our landscapes, and our sensory experiences set certain problems and offer certain visual answers. Circle and sphere sit right at the top of that shared toolkit. With the Diquis spheres, the context we have lets us say some things with moderate confidence. They were integrated into planned settlements, not scattered at random. They are consistently associated with places that look, by all other measures, like seats of authority. They required enough coordinated effort that they almost certainly express and reinforce social hierarchy. Their form is so strikingly regular and so carefully repeated that it is hard to imagine they did not also carry some more abstract, probably cosmological resonance. Beyond that, the ground becomes softer. Did each sphere stand for a specific ancestor, a specific clan, a specific direction? Did lines of stones map stories about migration or mythic battles? Did they mark moments in an agricultural calendar, or positions of certain stars, or pathways of spirits? We can propose models. Some alignments can be checked against solar positions. Some associations with burials suggest ancestral or funerary meanings. Oral traditions, even if they cannot be taken at face value for the deep past, at least show the kinds of ideas that feel natural to attach to these stones. But we are unlikely ever to reach the level of certainty we have for, say, classic Maya monuments with glyphs that literally spell out dates and names. The Diquis left us a system of signs without a key, so the honest endpoint is a mixture. On one side, a firm grounding, spheres as labour-hungry markers of elite centres, as tools in the quiet politics of status and authority. On the other, a halo of probable but unprovable layers, spheres as pieces in a larger mental map of cycles, boundaries, and cosmic order. What we can do is narrow the range of plausible meanings by paying close attention to where the stones are, what they sit beside, how they differ by size and grouping. We can rule out some of the louder fantasies, and we can outline the quieter, more human possibilities. And then we have to live with the remainder, the recognition that for the people who first raised them, these stones meant something both very practical and very deep, and that part of that depth will remain just out of reach. Which brings us to a broader puzzle. If the Diquis, working with their own tools and traditions, arrived at this particular way of shaping and placing stone, why do we see other cultures thousands of miles away doing something oddly similar with their own spherical objects? To get a sense of that, we can jump to a very different landscape and a very different time. Northern Scotland. Wind, heather, low light that makes stone look almost metallic. 5,000 years ago, long before the Diquis were building their plazas, people here were farming, raising animals, burying their dead in passage tombs, erecting standing stones. And in some of their settlements and graves, they left us objects that often end up on the same mysterious stone sphere lists as the Costa Rican balls. Neolithic carved stone balls. At first glance the resemblance seems obvious. They're round, they're stone. They look deliberate, not accidental. Put a photo of a Scottish ball next to a small Diquis sphere, and your brain wants to say, same thing. But once you look more closely, the differences start piling up. The Scottish objects are tiny by comparison. Most of them could sit in the palm of your hand. Typical diameters hover around 7 centimetres, about the size of a small orange. Many weigh less than a modern smartphone. A Diquis sphere, even a modest one, is bigger than your head, and heavy enough that you would think twice before trying to move it alone. The giants are so large they become pieces of landscape. Scale is not a minor detail. It changes everything about how an object can be used and where it makes sense to put it. The Scottish carved bulls also have an entirely different surface treatment. Instead of smooth, continuous curvature, they're bristling with knobs and projections. Most have 6 evenly spaced bosses. Some have 4, some even more, arranged with a kind of quiet mathematical care. On a few, the knobs are carved into spirals and concentric circles, echoing the abstract art you see on passage tombs like Newgrange and on other Neolithic stonework in Atlantic Europe. If a Diquis sphere is about erasing irregularities until only the pure form remains, a typical Scottish bull is about articulating the surface, breaking the sphere into repeating units. The contexts in which we find them are different as well. Diquis spheres, as far as we can tell, were usually fixed in place. They sat on prepared bases, edged plazas, flanked causeways, marked important thresholds. When they moved with effort, and probably not very often. The Neolithic bulls of Scotland, in contrast, are portable objects. They show up in pits, in what look like domestic settings, occasionally in burials, sometimes as stray finds with no clear architectural association. They're seldom found in neat lines. They are not anchoring the edges of great open spaces. They seem instead to have circulated by hand and by memory, moving through social networks rather than shaping the built environment. Those differences have led to very different interpretations. No one thinks the Scottish communities were rolling these tiny balls across fields like oversized marbles, and no one imagines people in Costa Rica casually stuffing basalt spheres into bags and walking off with them. The shared roundness is almost the least important thing about them. For the Neolithic carved bulls, archaeologists have floated 3 broad families of ideas. The first sees them as symbols of identity or status. In a world with no metal, no writing, and no easily transported prestige goods like glass, an intricately carved, time-consuming stone object becomes a natural candidate for a badge of rank. The variety of designs, different numbers of knobs, different incised patterns, would make it easy to imagine certain lineages or groups favouring particular styles. A bull might mark someone as belonging to a certain household, or as holding a particular ritual role. It could be carried, displayed, handed over in key moments, then stored away. The second family of interpretations treats them as tools. The knobs make them easy to grip. Some researchers have imagined them used as part of a cord-wrapping device, maybe for working hides or twisting fibres, where the protrusions help keep a loop of rope from slipping. Others have suggested they might have been part of a weapon, like the stone weights on South American bolas, though there is little direct evidence of that kind of use. A few show traces of wear that could be consistent with contact against other hard surfaces. The problem is that if they were primarily utilitarian tools, you might expect more consistent signs of hard use: chipping, abrasion patterns, breakage. Many are remarkably pristine, which leads to a third idea: social tokens. In this view, the bulls are tools, but not for shaping hides or throwing at animals. They are tools for shaping relationships, objects used in gift exchange, in ritualized negotiations, perhaps in ceremonies that mark the making and breaking of alliances. Their value would be less about what you can do with them physically, and more about the stories attached to them, the sequences of hands they have passed through. A perfect, carefully kept, slightly impractical object is very good at carrying that kind of weight. None of these interpretations has been definitively proven. There is no Neolithic manual that says this is your clan ball, guard it with your life, or attach 3 cords here and spin to process fibres. But the key point is that in the Scottish case, most archaeologists are not starting from stone plus sphere equals global mystery. They are starting from the contexts, the wear traces, the parallels with other local Neolithic art and practice. Roundness is just one clue among many. Set against that, the Diquis spheres look increasingly like members of a different family altogether. They are part of architecture, not handheld paraphernalia. They define space at the scale of plazas and paths, not at the scale of personal encounters and small rooms. Whatever meanings they carried had to operate at that larger scale too, broadcasting something to anyone who walked through those landscapes. This contrast carries an important methodological lesson. When people compile worldwide stone spheres and lay them out as if they are all instances of the same phenomenon, Costa Rica, Scotland, Bosnia, New Zealand river cobbles, naturally rounded concretions from Utah. They are collapsing categories that archaeologists work hard to keep separate. Yes, they are round, but they differ in size by orders of magnitude. They are made from different materials with different techniques. They sit in different kinds of context, some in burials, some in house floors, some as part of monumental axes, some scattered by erosion with no sign of human touch. Some are carved and decorated, some are merely smoothed, some are not shaped by humans at all. Treating all of them as pieces of one grand unsolved puzzle makes the world feel more mysterious. It also makes it harder to understand what any one group of people was actually doing. If you assume that a hand-sized carved ball on Orkney and a 3-meter granite sphere in a Costa Rican banana field must share an origin or a function because they are both round, you will almost certainly miss precisely the things that make each one most interesting. The similarity of outline becomes a kind of optical illusion, drawing your attention away from scale, from context, from labour and use. It is much more illuminating and frankly more respectful to the past to turn the problem around. Instead of asking, could all these spheres prove a single missing civilization, you ask, what can we learn by seeing how many different ways humans have put a simple shape to work? In Scotland, the answer seems to be, as intimate, portable objects, saturated with local aesthetic traditions and entangled in small-scale social life. In the Diquis Delta, the answer is closer to, as elements of monumental design, tied to hierarchy and to ideas of ordered space. Same general geometry, totally different registers of human experience. Recognizing that difference helps us keep our feet on the ground when we move on to even more controversial claims, places where round stones have been pulled into arguments not just about lost practices, but about lost continents and secret histories. Bosnia is one of those places where this distinction between similar outline and same phenomenon really matters. If you search for stone spheres online, you'll very quickly bump into photos from a forest in central Bosnia and Herzegovina. Rounded boulders lying among tree roots, some half-buried, some apparently freestanding. They look, at first glance, unnervingly like the Costa Rican spheres dropped into a European woodland. Because of that, they've become a magnet for tourists, for people genuinely curious about geology, and also for claims about lost civilizations, hidden energies, even ancient planetary catastrophes. The spheres are often folded into the same narratives that talk about Bosnian pyramids and secret tunnels, presented as further proof that mainstream archaeology is missing something vast. The reality, as usual, is quieter and more complicated. First, what are we actually looking at? Bosnia does have rounded stones in its river valleys and hillsides. Some of them are surprisingly regular. A few are large enough that standing next to them, you feel a faint echo of that Costa Rican effect, a sense of deliberate form intruding on an otherwise irregular landscape. But Bosnia is also a geologically active region. Layers of sandstone, conglomerate, and other sediments have been compressed, fractured, and soaked in mineral-rich water for a very long time. Under those conditions, nature has multiple ways of making round things that have nothing to do with human hands. Concretions, lumps of mineral cement that grow inside softer rock, can start as vaguely rounded blobs and, over hundreds of thousands of years, become remarkably spherical as minerals precipitate layer by layer around a central core. Think of it as geology's slow-motion version of a pearl. In some formations you get what geologists call spheroidal weathering. Blocks of rock, exposed to air and water, peel and shed corners over time. Edges get rounded off, layers flake away, and what started as a jagged chunk can, given long enough, end up looking almost like a ball. In rivers, strong currents roll stones along the bed, grinding them against other rocks. Sharp angles get knocked off. Over years and centuries, the most resistant pieces can evolve from blocks into cobbles, then into fairly smooth ovals or spheres. None of these processes require intention, or tools, or planning. They just require water, time, and rock of the right composition. So when someone points at a stone in Bosnia and says, "It's round, therefore it must be carved," that's not enough. Roundness by itself is not a smoking gun, it's a starting point. If you want to make the case that a particular Bosnian sphere is artificial, that a human took a natural stone and deliberately shaped it further, you need a different kind of evidence. You would look for clear, systematic modification of the surface. Facets from flaking or pecking, abrasion patterns that don't match what you'd expect from river movement, tool marks that have consistent direction and spacing. You might look for a prepared base under the stone, something to keep it from rolling, especially if it's sitting on a slope. You'd ask whether multiple spheres share the same size and finish, beyond what geology would easily produce. Perfectly matched diameters, for example, or a repeated pattern of partial smoothing that suggests a shared mental template. You'd also pay attention to context. Are the stones in places where people clearly built other things? Are they associated with walls, mounds, terraces, pathways, or foundations? Do you find artifacts, pottery, tools, bones, charcoal, right next to them, in undisturbed layers that can be dated and tied to a particular culture? Or are they scattered loosely across a hillside mixed with other boulders, with no obvious pattern and no trace of long-term human activity around them? With the Diquis spheres, the argument for human carving is robust because multiple lines of evidence converge. We find spheres sitting on prepared platforms. We see them edging plazas, flanking alignments, grouped by size. We can match tool marks on unfinished or broken examples to known pecking techniques. We have radiocarbon dates from architectural contexts in which they were clearly integrated. That is what convincing evidence looks like. Not one detail, but a web. With the Bosnian stones, that web is much more fragile. Some local researchers and promoters have claimed that the spheres are part of a grand prehistoric complex, contemporary with, or even older than any known European civilization. They point to their shape, to legends of giants and buried treasure, to the feel of the place. Occasionally they invoke alignments with stars or earth energies, but when you ask for the kinds of things archaeologists and geologists rely on, stratigraphic drawings, detailed petrographic analyses, radiometric dates tied to sealed layers, controlled excavations published in peer-reviewed journals, the picture gets fuzzy. There are studies, but many of them are preliminary, or limited in scope, or hosted in venues that don't require rigorous review. Some geologists who have examined the stones have concluded that they are natural concretions. Others allow that there might be occasional human modification, but see no evidence of an organized sphere-making tradition comparable to Costa Rica. Crucially, we do not yet have a securely excavated Bosnian sphere sitting in a clear archaeological context, on a built base, with surrounding features that demand a cultural explanation and can be dated independently. That absence doesn't prove that none of the spheres were ever touched by humans. People have always picked up interesting rocks, moved them, even polished or chipped them for their own purposes. It simply means that, so far, the extraordinary claims being made that these are relics of a lost global civilization, that they match other mysterious spheres across the world, are running far ahead of the available evidence. This is where provenance and documentation matter, sometimes more than the object itself. If someone shows you a photograph of a round stone found near a supposed pyramid site, that near hides a lot. Was it dug out of a layer with intact archaeological features? Was it sitting on the surface? Was it rolled downhill by a farmer 10 years ago? Did erosion move it from its original position centuries earlier? Without careful recording, you can't tell, and without being able to tell, you can't responsibly stack more and more speculative meaning on top of it. Archaeological provenance isn't just fussy paperwork. It's what lets you separate stone I like the look of from stone I can actually interpret. The same goes for peer review. When a claim is exciting, ancient spheres, hidden pyramids, lost knowledge, it's tempting to accept every supporting detail at face value. But slow, often frustrating processes like geological mapping, radiocarbon calibration, and formal publication are what keep us honest. They're the tools we use to distinguish between a persuasive story and a robust explanation. Looking at Bosnia through this lens doesn't require us to mock people who are excited by the stones, or to dismiss local enthusiasm. Curiosity is not a crime. Many important discoveries have started with someone saying, "This looks odd. I wonder what's going on here." Responsible skepticism means something gentler and more precise. It means being willing to say, these spheres are interesting, some are probably natural, a few might show human modification. We don't yet have solid evidence for a complex sphere-making culture here. Until we do, we should be cautious about linking them to Costa Rica, to Scotland, or to a worldwide lost civilization. It also means being comfortable with unknown as a temporary category. Not unknown, therefore impossible. Not unknown, therefore proof of everything I hope is true. Just unknown for now, awaiting better data. When we approach Bosnia that way, the situation stops being a battlefield between true believers and closed-minded academics, and becomes something simpler, an open geological and archaeological question in a region that still needs more careful, transparent research. And it becomes a useful example, because once you've watched how easily natural round stones can be swept into grand narratives, you're less likely to force the Diquis spheres, or the Scottish bulls, or any other rounded object into a single global story just because the shape feels uncanny. Instead, you start asking, what's the context? What's the provenance? What's been published and where? What would we need to see before changing our minds? Those questions don't kill wonder. They protect it. They keep us from building castles in the air so we can pay attention to the real, often stranger truth sitting quietly in the ground. And they prepare us to look again at other cases. Places where round stones really are entangled with colossal statues and unmistakable human labour, and where the question isn't natural or artificial, but why did people here decide to echo this shape on such an extraordinary scale? On Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, those questions land in a very different landscape. Here, nobody doubts that something extraordinary happened in stone. The island is famous for its moai, hundreds of massive carved figures, some weighing more than a fully loaded tractor trailer, hauled for kilometres and raised on stone platforms staring inland. If you want a place on Earth where human beings indisputably transformed rock into symbols at the edge of possibility, this is it. So when people hear that Easter Island has mysterious stone spheres too, it feels like the perfect puzzle piece. Spheres in Costa Rica, spheres in Bosnia, spheres in the Pacific, all tied together by colossal statues and lost knowledge. The reality, again, is quieter and more specific. First, what actually exists on Rapa Nui that's round? Archaeologists and early explorers do report rounded stones in ritual contexts. The one you'll see mentioned most often is called Te Pito o Te Henua, sometimes translated as the navel of the world. It's a smooth oval boulder sitting on the north coast, surrounded by smaller stones. Local traditions recorded in the 19th and 20th centuries linked it to the island's founders and to mana, a kind of spiritual potency that runs through Polynesian belief. Te Pito o Te Henua is strikingly regular. If you run your hands over it, you feel the same unnerving smoothness you get from a well-finished Diquis sphere. Photos, especially the ones that make the rounds online, tend to crop out everything but the big stone, frame it against the sea, and let your imagination do the rest. But if you look closely, it is not a mathematically perfect sphere. It's more of an elongated, slightly flattened ellipsoid. You can see the original bedding planes of the basalt if the light is right. It has been shaped and smoothed, yes, but it does not match the high-precision multimeter balls of Costa Rica. Elsewhere on the island, you get other rounded forms. At some ahu, the ceremonial platforms where moai were erected, you find small, carefully pecked stone knobs on the corners or along the edges. They're roughly spherical, hand-sized, probably made by pecking and grinding. Some appear to be architectural details, others may have served as markers or supports. You also see roundish stones used as pukao, the top knots or headdresses on some moai. Those are big cylinders of red scoria with rounded edges, rolled from a separate quarry. Occasionally, from a distance or in the wrong photograph, they can look like enormous red balls perched on statues. And finally, scattered across the landscape, there are naturally rounded boulders, lava bombs from ancient eruptions or blocks smoothed by weathering, that early Rapa Nui people may have noticed, moved or incorporated into structures. So there is a spectrum, from completely natural rounded rocks, through minimally modified boulders with symbolic rolls, up to deliberately shaped, carefully positioned objects like Te Pito o Te Henua and small carved knobs. But what there is not, as far as the archaeological record shows, is a systematic tradition of carving freestanding, high-precision stone spheres comparable to the Diquis tradition. No alignments of dozens of perfect balls marching across fields, no quarries full of partially finished globes, no evidence that make a separate perfect sphere was a major artistic or ritual goal. What Easter Island does show us powerfully is that a society can organize astonishing amounts of labor in stone. Polynesian cultures in general and Rapa Nui in particular were experts at this. Across the Pacific you see marae and heiau, stone platforms and temples, fish ponds built of fitted rock, roadways paved with slabs, and in some islands upright stones and carved figures that mark sacred spaces and genealogies. On Rapa Nui, that stoneworking tradition collided with volcanic geology in a very specific way. The island offered tool-grade basalt and relatively soft tuff that could be quarried and shaped into statues. Over generations, lineages competed to erect larger and more impressive moai on more elaborate platforms. They mobilized teams of workers to cut, move and raise these monoliths, using ropes, levers, sleds, and sheer coordination. This is not speculation. We can see the quarries at Rano-Raraku, with unfinished moai still attached to the bedrock. We can trace roads and ramps worn by hauling. We can date wood charcoal and pollen in the sediments to understand when major building phases occurred. And within this dense world of statues and platforms and stone-paved ritual spaces, smaller features, like a single smooth boulder, can easily be swept into larger stories. Te Pito o Te Henua is a good example. At some point, that stone was selected, moved, and placed carefully near an ahu. Later traditions imbued it with meaning, an object of power, perhaps a fragment brought from the homeland of the first settlers, perhaps a focal point for rituals connected to navigation or fertility. Its roundness became part of that meaning, echoing ideas of centre, origin and wholeness. Centuries after those traditions began, European visitors arrived with their own expectations. They collected stories selectively, sometimes mistranslating, sometimes simplifying complex ideas into neat quotes. In the 20th and 21st centuries, tourist brochures and internet posts shortened things further. The navel of the world became a magical perfect sphere from which compasses go crazy, and then proof of a global network of sphere makers. Some of those claims are just embroidered legend. Compasses can behave oddly near strongly magnetized rocks, but controlled measurements around Tepito or Tehenua have not revealed anything uniquely dramatic. The stone shape is unusual but not inexplicable in terms of human carving plus natural smoothing. In a landscape like Rapa Nui's, where giant human figures face the sea and stone platforms line the coasts, it is very easy for a single rounded stone to be pulled into every global theory that happens to be passing by. The same thing happens, in a different key, in Costa Rica. There, the spectacle isn't statues, it's the spheres themselves. But the underlying social force is similar. In both cases, a society organized tremendous amounts of labor not just to survive, but to create enduring, visible statements in stone. In both cases, those statements were tied to social coordination, lineage identity, ritual authority, perhaps political competition. Building or placing something massive or meticulously shaped that everyone can see is one way to make social order tangible. It says, we can do this. We can gather workers. We can feed them. We can maintain the knowledge needed to quarry, shape and move heavy rock precisely. With the Diquis spheres, the spectacle is in the geometric perfection and the repetition. Dozens of near-perfect globes dotting plazas and ridgelines. On Rapa Nui, the spectacle is in verticality and posture, ranks of elongated heads and torsos, balanced on carefully engineered platforms, wearing red top knots. In both places, round or rounded stones show up inside larger projects. Pukao are rolled and lifted onto statues. Corner knobs give platforms a finished, almost decorative touch. A smoothed boulder becomes the island's symbolic centre. These echo smaller scale uses of round stones elsewhere in Polynesia, where cobbles define sacred precincts, or mark important spots on trails and shorelines. If you step back, you can see how easy it is, once the internet is involved, to connect these echoes into a supposed global pattern. Spheres in Costa Rica, balls in Scotland, rounded boulders in Bosnia, a smoothed navel stone on a Pacific island. Taken as thumbnails on a screen, stripped of context, they look like variations of one mysterious theme. But when we look more carefully, the similarities loosen. Different materials, different techniques, different scales, different dates, sometimes separated by thousands of years. Different meanings woven into local mythologies and political histories. What links Rapa Nui to Costa Rica is not a secret brotherhood of sphere makers. It's that in both places human communities turned hard stone into social tools, objects that required coordination to create, and that, once made, helped coordinate people in turn. Those tools could be bodies with faces 10 meters high, or near-perfect globes a meter across. They could be corner knobs you'd only notice if you walked right past the platform, or a single smoothed boulder that stories call the centre of the world. Seen that way, Easter Island doesn't solve the mystery of the Diquis spheres, and the Diquis spheres don't explain Easter Island. Each tradition has its own internal logic. What they do together is remind us that when we talk about stone, we're talking about more than geology and craftsmanship. We're talking about how people choose to make their presence felt in the landscape, how they use difficult shapes, whether a precarious upright statue or a stubbornly even sphere, as proofs of cooperation. And once we understand that, We can look at stone balls and stone heads without needing to merge them into a single global story, and still feel the quiet strangeness of what it means to bend rock into meaning. If we strip away the internet collages and look at the archaeological record on its own terms, we still have to face one stubborn fact. Round things keep showing up, not always as perfect spheres, not always carved, not always monumental. But again and again, in very different places and times, you find humans putting effort into making things that are symmetrical, centered, and conspicuously geometric. So why does that happen? Part of the answer lies deep in how our minds work. Human brains are pattern hungry. Our visual systems are tuned to notice symmetry, contrast, and clean lines against noisy backgrounds. A smooth curve stands out in a landscape of jagged rocks and tangled vegetation, the way a clear melody stands out from static. In psychology experiments, people across cultures tend to find balanced, symmetric shapes more pleasing and more complete than irregular ones. Simple geometric forms, circles, squares, triangles, are easier to remember and to agree on. Make it round is a clearer instruction than make it sort of like that one rock we saw 3 days ago. So when people in the Diquis Delta, or in Neolithic Scotland, or on some hill in Bosnia decided to mark a place, or invest labour in something that would last, it's not surprising that many of them gravitated toward clean geometry. A sphere, in that sense, is one of the purest possible shapes. Every point on the surface is the same distance from the centre. You can rotate it any way you like, and it looks the same. It doesn't have a front or a back, a left or a right. That's not just mathematically elegant, it's symbolically useful. If you want an object to stand for wholeness, or the world, or completeness, a round stone is a ready-made metaphor. You don't need calculus to feel that. A child rolling a ball in the dust gets the idea. But a sphere is also a strange choice if your main concern is practicality. From a purely utilitarian perspective, a cube or a cylinder is often easier. Flat faces stack. They don't wander off on their own. They're simpler to cut from blocky rock. Even rounded cylinders like the Pukao on Easter Island can be rolled and then parked without fuss. Perfect spheres are awkward. They roll when you don't want them to. They take up more volume for the same footprint. They give you no stable resting face unless you engineer supports. And yet, they show up. This is where another layer of explanation comes in. Convergent design. In biology, convergence is when unrelated species evolve similar features because they're solving similar problems. Dolphins and ichthyosaurs both ended up streamlined with flippers and tails, not because they shared a recent ancestor with that body plan, but because fast swimming in water pushes bodies in that direction. Cultures can do something similar with ideas and objects. Give different societies the same basic raw materials, stone, human hands, pattern-seeking brains, and some of the same geometric shapes will recur, not because of a shared blueprint, but because the design space isn't infinite. Circles, spheres, and other simple forms lie in the part of that space that is both cognitively satisfying and physically robust. Stone spheres are extremely durable. They chip, but they don't lose their overall shape easily. They weather into softer versions of themselves. If you want a symbol that outlasts wood, cloth, and bone, carving a geometric solid in rock is a good bet. At the same time, spheres are technically demanding. They are, in a sense, an extravagant proof. Almost any culture that works stone will discover that you can roughly round a boulder by knocking the corners off. But pushing that rough roundness toward real precision, toward the uncanny regularity you see in the best Diquis examples, costs time. You have to remove stone you don't need to remove. You keep pecking and grinding long after the object is recognizably round. From a subsistence point of view, that extra effort is wasteful. From a social point of view, it can be powerful. An object that is more precise than it needs to be for any simple task is an object making a statement. It says, we have labour to spare. We can afford to do this the hard way. We can coordinate dozens of people over weeks or months to pursue a purely geometric ideal. That logic is not unique to Costa Rica. You see echoes of it in polished jade axes in Neolithic Europe that were never used to cut wood, or in carefully ground stone discs in Mesoamerica that show no wear but must have taken hundreds of hours to shape. Behind those objects is a similar calculus. Practicality isn't the point. Display is. When that kind of display meets simple measurement tricks, very high precision becomes achievable without any advanced machinery. Take a large, roughly spherical stone. If you have cord, water, and patient eyes, you can refine it surprisingly far. One method is rotational checking. You pick a point to be your pole, rest the stone in a shallow cradle, and rotate it slowly. Any bulge will lift the center. Any flat will let it settle oddly. You mark the high spots with charcoal or pigment, peck them down, and repeat. Over and over, the extremes get shaved away. Another is string measurement. You loop a cord around the stone at different angles. If the loop sits snugly all the way around without gaps or tight spots, that section is close to circular. If it snags, you mark and adjust. You can do this across many great circles like lines of longitude and latitude. You don't need numbers, just consistency. You can also use simple templates, curved wooden or bone gauges shaped to a desired radius, and walk them over the surface feeling for bumps and hollows, or sight along the silhouette of the stone against the sky, looking for breaks in the curve. None of this is mysterious. It's slow, but it's within the reach of any patient artisan with good hand-eye coordination. Given enough repetitions, error shrinks. The Diquis sphere makers didn't have to know geometry as a written science. They embodied it as a craft. Once you appreciate that, the social side of the story comes into sharper focus. Imagine a village in the Diquis Delta deciding to commission a new sphere for its main plaza. That decision sets a lot of subtle processes in motion. You're not just making an object. You're organizing quarrying teams to cut or select a suitable blank. You're assigning skilled carvers to the project, which means those people aren't farming or hunting as much. You're bringing food and water to the work site. You're deciding where eventually this heavy, awkward thing will sit, and who gets to speak or perform around it. The finished sphere, then, is not only a shape, it's a frozen record of cooperation. It might function as a prestige object associated with a particular lineage or chief. It might be a kind of communal monument, marking a founding story or a claim to land. It might serve in rituals that reinforce who belongs, who leads, and who owes tribute. In many societies, big, difficult things, megaliths, pyramids, moai, gigantic earthworks, do this kind of work. They are signals of authority written in labour and stone. A stone sphere does something similar, but in a particularly abstract way. It doesn't look like a god or an ancestor. It looks like a concept, centre, completeness, balance. Its very uselessness for ordinary tasks highlights its role as a public sign. It belongs to the group, but it also stands slightly apart from everyday life. And here we come back to the global collages. Because these shapes feel so fundamental, it's tempting to take the next step and say, maybe they're not independent at all. Maybe the Diquis spheres, the Scottish carved balls, the Bosnian boulders, the smooth stones of distant islands, all trace back to a single civilization, now lost, that seeded the idea of the stone sphere around the world. This is a powerful story. It satisfies our desire for connection and for a hidden layer beneath scattered facts. It's not impossible in the logical sense. People have been crossing water and exchanging ideas for a very long time, but if we ask what the evidence supports, it starts to fray. The known stone spheres and sphere-like traditions are separated by vast distances, by different raw materials and by big gaps in time. The Costa Rican spheres cluster mainly in the 1st and early 2nd millennium CE. The Scottish carved balls belong to the late Neolithic, around 3000 to 2500 BCE. The supposed Bosnian spheres have mixed origins, many of them natural. Other rounded ritual stones elsewhere can be centuries or millennia apart again. We don't see a continuous chain of transmission or shared iconography riding along with the shape. We don't see matching tool traditions, matching myths, or a trail of intermediate sites knitting these practices together into a single cultural horizon. What we do see is that whenever humans have stone, time, and reasons to build visible statements in their landscapes, some of them independently discover the same family of solutions: upright slabs, circles of stones, mounds, platforms, and sometimes conspicuously round objects. Under those conditions, the recurrence of spheres doesn't require a global blueprint. Convergent design, psychological attraction to symmetry, the durability of geometric forms, and the social power of hard-to-make shapes together go a long way. None of this means we've solved the meanings of any particular stone sphere. Local histories still matter. A Diquis ball is not a Scottish ball, is not a Rapa Nui boulder. Each carries its own stories, many of them now only faintly echoed in oral tradition or ground into dust by time. But when we put them side by side, we don't have to choose between random coincidence and secret supercivilization. There's a middle ground in which human minds, facing similar broad challenges, sometimes reach for the same elegant shapes, and then load them with very different local meanings. And it's in that middle ground that the mystery of the Diquis spheres becomes more, not less, interesting. Because it forces us to ask not just why people in general like roundness, but why this particular society in this particular river delta took the idea further than almost anyone else. That's the part we still don't fully understand, and it leads directly to the last piece of the puzzle: what we're missing, and what kinds of evidence might finally let us read these stones with more than guesswork. When archaeologists talk about the Diquis spheres, there are three questions that keep coming up in different forms, no matter how many field seasons go by. What exactly were they for? How exactly were they arranged? And who exactly was organizing the work? Function, placement, and production. Those are the big unknowns. On function, we have educated guesses. The spheres are found in association with settlements, mounds, pavements, and sometimes alignments that seem anything but random. Their size range from handheld to several tons hints at a hierarchy of importance. Some were clearly placed in formal spaces, others might have been more domestic, but symbol of power or marker of status is still broad. Were they tied to particular clans, to origin stories, to astronomical events, to the authority of regional chiefs? Or did their meanings shift over centuries as societies changed? Just as medieval churches, pagan shrines, and modern tourist sites can all occupy the same hilltop at different times. We don't yet know. On arrangement, the gaps are even sharper. Very few spheres today sit exactly where they were placed in the pre-Columbian period. Many were dragged into town squares, front yards, bank gardens, and government buildings in the 20th century. Others were moved by plantation companies when they cleared land for bananas. Some were rolled, cracked, or cut by bulldozers. Each move separated a stone from the archaeological context that gives it meaning. That context includes its position relative to houses, mounds, and paths, its orientation in the landscape toward a river bend, a mountain, a sunrise point on the horizon, its relationship to other spheres, solitary sentinel, paired marker, line, triangle, arc. Photographs and early accounts preserve a few original groupings, lines of spheres leading up to elevated platforms, pairs flanking supposed entrances, clusters that might once have formed geometric figures when seen from above. But might is doing a lot of work there. We don't have a full map of how the Diquis people used these stones to write in their landscape, and then there's production. We know roughly how you could make such spheres with hammerstones and patience. But we don't yet know how production was organised socially. Were there specialised workshops near quarries, staffed by hereditary artisans whose skills were passed down like a family trade? Were spheres carved intermittently by villagers in between farming seasons, more like community projects than elite commissions? Were different regions producing slightly different styles, with preferences that we haven't yet teased apart because the best comparative data was destroyed before anyone mapped it? These are the kinds of questions that turn a neat object into a social system. Right now, our answers are thin. If there's good news, it's that we're not entirely helpless. There are tools, literal and figurative, that could sharpen the picture if we use them carefully and if we protect what's left. One of the most promising areas is remote sensing. Modern techniques like LiDAR, laser scanning from aircraft, can strip away forest canopy in the data and reveal subtle ground features, low mounds, old causeways, terraces, and possible building platforms that are almost invisible at eye level under vegetation. In parts of Costa Rica, LiDAR has already begun to show hidden pre-Columbian landscapes, gridded fields, rectilinear earthworks, and patterns that look more like organised town planning than scattered hamlets. When you overlay known sphere locations onto those reconstructions, you can start asking more precise questions. Do spheres cluster along processional routes? Do they frame plazas that were once ringed with houses? Do they mark boundaries between fields and sacred spaces? Are their positions tied to sight lines of particular mountains or to dry season sunrise points? None of this answers function directly, but it constrains the possibilities. A stone that consistently anchors the same place in a settlement plan across centuries is probably more than a random ornament. Ground surveys still matter here. People walking slowly with notebooks, GPS units, and total stations, recording the exact position and elevation of each sphere, each shard of pottery, each patch of altered soil. That patient mapping work turns individual finds into patterns. Then there's microanalysis, looking not at the landscape scale, but at the surface of the stones themselves. Under magnification, even a seemingly smooth sphere tells a story. Tiny impact scars can reveal the direction and intensity of pecking blows, hinting at carving sequences. Polished patches in certain zones might indicate how people touched or handled the stone, whether they were rolling smaller spheres in the hand, rubbing them in rituals, or leaving offerings that abraded particular spots. Traces of pigments, resins, or adhered materials, if any surviving cracks and low spots, might show that some spheres were painted or decorated with organic add-ons. That would change how we imagine them. Not just mute grey forms, but once brightly marked, maybe with clan emblems or cosmological motifs that have long since flaked away. Microscopic residue analysis is delicate, and the tropical climate is harsh on organics, but even a few positive results could reframe the whole set. Experimental archaeology can work in parallel. Teams of modern craftspeople and archaeologists can attempt to reproduce spheres using only tools and rock types known from the region, hammerstones of certain hardnesses, rough blanks of the same granodiorite or gabbro, water and sand for grinding. By timing each stage, they can estimate labour costs, how many person days to go from a quarried boulder to a rough sphere, and from there to a polished, near-perfect one. How many people you need simply to move it safely without modern machinery. How often you must resharpen tools, where the bottlenecks are. Those numbers feed back into the social questions. A sphere that takes several hundred person days to make is unlikely to be a casual side project. It implies some combination of surplus food, authority to direct labour, or a ritual schedule that justifies the investment. If we can correlate estimated labour costs with sphere size, proximity to elite residences and other markers, we can start to see not just that these stones mattered, but how much they mattered in economic terms. All of these methods, however, depend on something that sounds boring but is absolutely crucial: provenience. Provenience is the exact recorded place where an artifact was found. In archaeology, losing provenience is like tearing chapters out of a book and shuffling the loose pages into a decorative pile. The words are still there, but most of the story is gone. Every time a sphere is dug up by a backhoe without documentation, or moved to decorate a driveway without a detailed site record, we lose information we can never get back. Depth, exact orientation, associated materials in the soil, the layers above and below it. Protecting the remaining in situ contexts, that is, spheres still in or near their original positions, is the single best thing we can do if we want future researchers to have more than guesswork. That means legal protections, yes, but also public awareness, so that landowners and local communities see these not just as curiosities or obstacles, but as irreplaceable pages in a shared story. Before we go further, this is also a good place to mention something quietly related to that long view of the past. If you like this kind of slow, evidence-first exploration of human history, there's a whole book built in that same spirit, available at sleepytimehistory.com. It dives into other deep time puzzles in the same calm, careful way. And since you're listening to this during the week it comes out, there's a discount running right now if you'd like to pick up a copy. In a way, the Diquis spheres themselves are like an unread book whose spine we can see, but whose pages we can only glimpse at the edges. We know they are not impossible objects. We can explain how they could be carved. We can place them in a plausible timeline. We can compare them to other stone traditions without invoking lost continents. The mystery that remains is subtler. It lives in the gap between technical ability and chosen use, between the general fact that humans like symmetry and the specific decision of a community to spend enormous effort making one particular shape in one particular landscape for reasons that once felt obvious to them and now feel opaque to us. That's why the unanswered questions about function, arrangement, and organization matter, not because they threaten to overturn physics or rewrite all of world history, but because they open a rare window into how power, craft, and meaning came together in a society that left no written records of its own. Every new survey, every carefully excavated sphere, every microscopic scratch analysed under a lens has the potential to make that window a little clearer. And as it clears, the story that comes into focus is unlikely to be a tale of impossibility. It's more likely to be something quieter and, in a way, more extraordinary. A record of how ordinary humans with stone tools and shared beliefs turned raw boulders into symbols that ordered their world. In the final part of this journey, we'll sit with that quieter kind of wonder and consider what these rounded stones can still offer us, even if we never manage to answer all of our questions. If we pause for a moment and gather up everything we've traced so far, a pattern begins to emerge that is less like a conspiracy board and more like a set of overlapping circles. On one circle, we have the Diquis spheres themselves. We know they were carved in the last 1500 years before European contact, not in some remote Ice Age past. We know the rock types. We know they could have been made with hammerstones, pecking, grinding and polishing, without any need to smuggle lost technologies into the story. We know they sit within a broader Cherokee cultural tradition that already included mound building, metalworking, long-distance trade, and complex social hierarchies. We can say, with reasonable confidence, that they were not ballast from alien craft, not magnetic anomalies, not relics of an Atlantean super-civilization. We can also say that they mattered. Their size range, their careful shaping, their association with formal spaces and mounds. These all point away from mere decoration and towards some combination of status marker, cosmological symbol, and instrument of social order. Whoever directed the work had the authority to marshal time, food, and labour, to make rocks round and to give those rounds a place in how communities understood themselves. On another circle we have the wider world of stone spheres and near spheres. In Scotland, the carved stone balls are small, hand-held, and elaborately decorated, belonging to a completely different era and toolkit. In Bosnia, the supposed giant mystery spheres dissolve, on close inspection, into a mix of natural concretions and a few ambiguous cases that may or may not involve human modification. On Easter Island, roundish stones appear not as a defining monument type, but as part of a wider sculptural and ritual landscape dominated by statues. None of these line up neatly with Diquis' practice in terms of date, scale, context, or meaning. They are not chapters in a single global manual of sphere-making. Yet there is a quieter commonality. Across cultures and times, people seem to be drawn to certain simple, powerful forms, circles, lines, axes, crosses, and occasionally spheres. They are shapes that are easy to notice, hard to ignore, and endlessly reusable as symbols. A perfect or near-perfect round object is both obviously artificial and strangely abstract. It can stand for the sun, the moon, an eye, a breast, an egg, a boundary, a world. So while the Diquis spheres are unique in concentration and scale, they also sit in a broader human habit, using geometry to make meaning visible. Some questions, after all this, feel less mysterious than they did at the start. We no longer need a hidden civilization to explain the technical side of the spheres. We can outline plausible quarrying and shaping methods. We can sketch reasonable transport strategies through wetlands and along rivers. We can situate the spheres within the timeline of regional chiefdoms, rather than on the margins of time. But other questions remain stubbornly open. We still do not know the full grammar of how spheres were arranged in the Diquis landscape. We see isolated sentences, lines up to platforms, pairs by probable entrances, but not the whole paragraph. We don't know what stories people told about them. Were there myths that named the largest spheres, that tied them to ancestral beings or celestial events? Did children grow up learning which stones belonged to their lineage, which to others, which were dangerous to touch? Somewhere in the 16th century, as epidemics tore through communities and colonial systems took root, those storylines were interrupted. We don't know how meaning shifted over time. A stone set up in one century as a grave marker could, a few generations later, anchor a boundary or serve as a throne. The archaeological record tends to flatten those changes into a single snapshot, and we don't know, even with the best tools, how much has already been erased. For every sphere still sitting quietly in a field, there may have been others rolled into ditches, broken for fill, or ground by machinery. Each loss leaves us with a more fragmentary text, harder to read. In the face of all that uncertainty, it can be tempting to reach for dramatic explanations, to fill the gaps with smooth stories about vanished masters of geometry or messages carved in stone for a global audience. But there's another kind of wonder available here, one that grows not out of certainty, but out of restraint. It's the wonder of realizing that ordinary humans, in a particular corner of what is now Costa Rica, chose to anchor their world in something as unassuming as shaped rock, that they invested their labour and imagination into rounding boulders that no longer speak our language, but still hold their place in the ground with quiet insistence. It's the wonder of seeing how far careful evidence can take us, through dates, tool marks, labour estimates, landscape analysis, and where it stops. The point at which we have to admit that some meanings are not recoverable, not because they are supernatural, but because history is fragile, and it's the wonder of noticing that this pattern repeats. In Scotland, in the Pacific, in river valleys and highlands across the globe, different peoples at different times solved different problems, yet sometimes reached for similarly simple shapes when they needed to give weight to power, memory, or the sacred. We may never reconstruct exactly what a Diquis artisan thought as they chipped away at a rough block, or what a child felt walking past a row of finished spheres that had stood longer than anyone could remember. We can only circle those experiences with hypotheses, guided by what the ground and the stones will still tell us. But even that partial view has value. It reminds us that the past is not an alien planet populated by impossibilities. It is a series of choices made by people who were, in many respects, like us, capable of patience, coordination, aesthetic judgment, and deep belief. The mystery is not that they made these spheres. The mystery is what precisely they saw in them. As new surveys, excavations, and analyses accumulate, some of our open questions will narrow. Others will probably remain permanently unresolved. That is not a failure of science. It is simply the shape of our relationship to deep time. If you've stayed with this journey all the way to the end, and you enjoy this kind of calm, evidence-first exploration of the ancient world, you might also like the book I mentioned earlier about prehistoric secrets and the ways we uncover them. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you'd like to help more stories like this reach more people, it truly does make a difference if you tap like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what you think the most intriguing open question about the Diquis spheres is. For now, the stones are still there, quiet, rounded